Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another episode of From ABD to PhD Show, where we provide strategies on how to navigate the dissertation process and prepare for life as doctor. I'm your host, Dr. Ramon Goings, founder of Done Dissertation, where we demystify the dissertation process so that you, the doctoral student, can write and defend your dissertation in 1 year or less. If you're a doctoral student who is looking for support and you want to get through your dissertation process quickly, we want to invite you to apply to the Velocity Group Coaching Program, who is our sponsor for today's episode. The Velocity Group Coaching Program is a 4-month coaching experience with the goal to help you write and defend either your dissertation proposal or final dissertation within the next 4 months. So if you want to finish your dissertation quickly and you are tired of being an ABD and want to have everything that comes along with finishing your doctorate, what I want you to do is go to www.velocitydissertation.com to learn more about our program and to apply. Today's episode, I'm so excited to have our special guest, Dr. Tanisha Ranger, who is a licensed clinical psychologist and owner of the company Insight to Action, who specializes in helping adults and adolescents overcome sexual addiction and compulsion, chronic relationship problems, and trauma. We often talk about the various things that we can do with our doctorate, and I wanted to bring someone who has the mental health background to really talk about what you can do once you get your doctorate, if from our folks who are in clinical psychology, because we get a number of folks who have this particular interest. So I wanted to make sure that we have a lot of different career options and opportunities so you can see the spectrum, what's available to you. So with that, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Ranger. Dr. Ranger, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Hi,
Thank you so
thanks for
much.
having me.
No problem, no problem. And so how we like to always get into this conversation is just, a lot of folks think that people who have their doctors, they started out this way, right? And so, I see your facial expression, right? We don't start out like this. And so I would love to hear from you when you were, younger. Did you ever think about, even as a kid or maybe as you were approaching, maybe high school and college, did you think about getting a doctorate? Was this always in your fortune for yourself?
So I am first generation. So yes, uh, my mother is from Ghana, West Africa, and I was born here. If you know anyone who has an immigrant parent, you know for sure doctor was mentioned. Absolutely, it was in the air. I threw out a couple of other concerns, like, oh, maybe I want to be a hairdresser. And I was told no, that wasn't going to happen. But when I was in high school and it was time to figure out what I was going to do for college, I'm not sure how it came up, but I decided that I was going to get a degree in psychology. And what I knew at that time was, if you're going to get a degree in psychology, you're going to have to get a doctorate. Otherwise, it will have been time wasted. That's what it felt like. And
I've heard the
so,
same thing. Yeah.
yeah, so I pursued a bachelor's in psychology at a technical school, which is a fun mixture. So my bachelor's is a BS as opposed to a BA in
Okay.
psychology. It was very um, what's the word? It was very focused on statistics and
Okay.
research and running experiments, that kind of stuff, and it was actually kind of fun.
Yeah.
Um, and then I switched over to an arts side for psychology when I went into grad school. I took a year off between undergrad and grad school because I was burned out.
I hear you.
Um,
I hear you on that.
I crawled over the finish line. I hated school. I hated everybody. I it was like, when I was younger, when I was 17 and I was going into undergrad, I was like, I know for me, I'm going to have to go straight through because if I stop, I won't finish. Um, but after getting through the first part, I was like, if I don't stop, I will not be okay.
Understood.
And um, it took a lot of like soul searching because I truly believed for a long time if I took a break between undergrad and grad school, that I would not finish grad school.
I thought the same thing.
And then getting to that point of the idea of being in another classroom making me physically ill, I had to rethink that. But yeah, it was a direct path. I did know that once I chose psychology, that I would get a doctorate.
Okay.
I don't know how long it was going to take, but I knew it was going to have to happen because that's the only way that I was going to make any real money.
Understood. Yeah, and so I'm curious about that idea in psychology. So for a number of folks who are considering this as a career, is the doctorate the main route to making income? Like, is there anything in between that folks can do, or is it something you have to think differently about how to use the degree?
So for me, because I'm a clinical psychologist, there is no in between. There
Mm,
is no master's level licensure for a clinical psychologist.
gotcha.
However, for counseling psychologists, there is. You could be an LPC, which is a licensed professional counselor. Um, and that was a distinction that I didn't know at the time.
Sure.
So I went into my doctoral program, and around 3 years in, I was burned out again. And I was like, maybe I'll just stop with a master's. And
Yeah.
that was when I discovered, like, you can, but you shouldn't.
Right. Right. Right.
Because, so the rest of it was just like a hard slog. Like, I'm in too deep. I've gone too far. I have to keep going, or I'm just going to be a huge mess, financially speaking.
Understood. I know that makes sense. I know for a lot of us, we always have to make decisions about what makes best sense. And I think for me, when I got my bachelor's degree in music education, and then I couldn't find in 2008 when I graduated, I couldn't find a teaching position. So I went and ended up working in human services, and I liked what I was doing. I said, "Oh, I'll get a degree in like human services with a focus in clinical counseling." And then what I found out, something similar to what you said, is that the money's not there in this thing. I got to get a doctorate or do something different because the
Mhm.
money just didn't make sense for what the work was going to require. So definitely, we sometimes have to make those calls and those decisions that make the best sense,
Yeah,
for our
it
career.
didn't feel great at the time, but, looking at it logically, rationally, it was like, if you don't if you don't go all the way through, you'll have a master's, but you'll never be able to get licensed, which is going to
Mhm.
vastly limit how much money you can make anyway. And then where you can work, you'll always have to be under someone's supervision, which is always going to be either a doc in your pay or you're going to have to pay a supervisor.
Yeah.
Um, and you've already taken out too much money in student loans to be able to pay back living that kind of life.
I hear you. And then the
Yeah.
way that PSLF is not really giving folks what they need anyway, so I get it. Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah. I too have a predatory loan. Uh,
I understand. Yeah.
so yeah, it was a difficult decision. Like, there were a lot of decisions along the path. People always ask me if I would talk to their kids about, my career path. And the main thing that I tell people is that when I went into undergrad, I had a very clear idea of what I was going to be doing. That is not what I do today, not even close. And the real thing that I tell people is to be clear about your destination, but be flexible about your pathway. Because there were a lot of different things that I didn't think I would be interested in. And I just said yes to get an experience. And it turned out to be really great, which is how I ended up in sex addiction in the first place.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%, because if I looked at my career trajectory, it'd be like, I started out in music, did that for a while. Then I went to special education because I saw a need there. And then
Hmm.
from that, when I started my doctoral program around that time, I had a classmate who was like, "Hey, Ramon," he used to work as a legislative director for a congressman. He was like, "Hey, you should look at policy and be able to use your research and experience being a teacher in the policy setting." So I went from that to working for doing a fellowship at the White House for a White House initiative. Had I not been said yes to experiences, I never would have gotten all those skill sets that I still use to this day.
Yeah,
And I think it's just I think
absolutely.
our paths like an accumulation of skill sets more so than
Yeah, one of my good friends in grad school was a fine arts major. She had her BFA. She was an exceptional painter, and that was when I learned that, just because you want to get a doctorate in psychology does not mean you have to have an undergrad degree in psychology. You can literally do whatever you want. Just make sure you have the appropriate prerequisites.
no, that
And
makes
that's what I tell anybody who wants me to talk to their kids. That's what I tell their kids. Like, even if you want to be a psychologist, that does not mean you have to have a psychology major in undergrad. You can major in whatever makes you feel happy, and make sure you get the appropriate prerequisites to get you into a program, because most doctoral degree programs do want someone who's well rounded.
Yeah, no, I agree with that 100%. And so, you go through undergrad, you get into your master's program, your doctoral program. What was it like when you first transitioned into doing doctoral work? Would you easily acclimate, or was it something that you had to really develop the skill set when you first were starting? 'Cause I know a lot of students struggle with that transition, like first year in the doctoral program.
So my real struggle was my first year in undergrad,
Okay.
because I didn't have anybody telling me like, "Hey, go to class." And Lord knows the professors didn't care if you showed up or not. They were
Right, right,
they
right,
were
right.
going to work. They didn't care. Uh, and so that was the real transition. I think going from undergrad to grad school, the work didn't feel different, and perhaps that was a factor, like, around the undergrad program that I chose. That
Sure.
was relatively rigorous. It was a pretty exclusive school. Um, and it was a tech school. So they were not going easy on us liberal arts majors. And so when I got to grad school, it didn't feel like the work was more difficult. Um, but my as yet undiagnosed at that time, ADHD was definitely kicked into high gear. As most girls who definitely have ADHD, who are also smart, I flew under the radar
Sure.
for decades at this
Yeah.
point because I had a very, very good memory and no study skills. And that got me through a lot. But, getting into grad school where it was like sustained effort over
Yeah,
time,
no memory. That starts to
I'm,
limit
I,
you.
to this day, I don't feel like I have the capacity for that. It's really hard,
Right.
that part. Like, so the content wasn't, hugely different. I
Sure.
can write, you know, um, but oh man, managing my time was a nightmare.
And so what strategies did you put in place to do that? So I know that's a number of, we have folks, and this might not have been your situation, but I know a number of people who get into their doc program and might have families or trying to navigate just life, other obligations in addition to like being a doc student. And so like what
Mhm.
strategies or what systems did you put in place for yourself to be able to, just manage it all?
Absolutely none. It was a nightmare for a real long time. Um, I would I would roll into class like having just snatched whatever paper off the printer.
Sure.
Any grade that I got below an A or B is because it was late. So I did not manage my time well at all. At one point, it became incredibly overwhelming,
Sure.
and I actually started to go see a therapist, and she sort of changed my life. I only saw her briefly, but she instilled a mindset in me that has been helpful ever since. And that mindset was about moving away from beating myself up about what how I was different from my peers and being more focused on creating scaffolding for myself so that I could get what I need to get done. And I ended up taking a semester off, uh, and that pushed me basically a year out from getting my degree, but it was worth it because I was starting to lose it.
No, I get it. And I think I always tell folks sometimes the best thing you can do to get your doctor is take the break that you might need to
Yeah.
rejuvenate and recoup.
17-year-old me was 100% sure that I should not take any breaks. But I got into these programs and I was like, it's time to rethink some things. And so, yeah, I got into therapy when I was in grad school. She was fantastic. She was a psychologist.
Wow.
She was a Black woman. And she saw me for $10 a session because I was a broke college grad
Wow.
student. And I mean, helped me tremendously to the point where the things that she talked with me about are things that I use when I do my own therapy with my clients.
No, that's phenomenal. And so,
Mhm.
as you're getting to the program, you're working with your therapist, figuring things out. At one point, where did you start to develop your research interests? Like, how did that evolve for you? Did you already know going in what you wanted to study, or was it something that happened over time being a student?
So, not just my research interest, but like my career interest, they changed drastically from the time I went into undergrad, even from the time I went into grad school. So I
Mhm.
chose my program because they have dual degrees. And at the time, I wanted to be a forensic psychologist. And so I had done an internship that I don't know how that came about, but it was with a forensic psychologist who worked in the court system in Massachusetts. And I was with her, I shadowed her, I worked with the people in probation. And one of the things that she told me that I took to heart was this was while I was still in undergrad. She said, don't get a degree in forensic psychology. She said, if you would like to do forensic psychology, it's really easy to specialize. But if you get just a straight up clinical degree, you will give yourself so much more flexibility because there may come a day when you don't care about forensic psychology anymore, and then you will have pigeonholed yourself. So I ended up
Mm.
choosing my program based on the fact that they had a whole bunch of dual degrees, including JD PsyD. I didn't do that one. And they had a master's in criminal justice that you would also get with your PsyD, and it cost extra and it took a little more time, but you end up with 2 degrees. And so I went there with the intent to do that.
Mhm.
And then I discovered that all of the criminal justice classes that they had in the manual that were so interesting to me were not being offered, and they had no idea when they would be offered.
Oh
So
gosh,
at
yeah.
that point, I was sitting in white collar crime, like, oh my Lord, I don't care about any of this.
Right, right.
And so I ended up dropping the MA in criminal justice and just going with the straight PsyD. I got trained as a school psychologist. I went and I did an internship with the school. I even took the praxis, and I was like, I don't love this.
Gotcha.
And so like I really I'm grateful to the program for having so many ways for us to try things out.
Yeah.
Um, Part of why I chose a PsyD over a PhD was that I'd met someone in a different co-op who was a PsyD, and I was like, "What is that?" I was 20. I was still in undergrad. I was at this, you know, it wasn't a residential treatment facility, but it was acute care in a hospital for children with psychiatric concerns. And she was like, "Well, I chose a PsyD because with the PhD programs, it was looking like you would just do your coursework for 4 years and then be on internship. And I didn't want to have my first time meeting a client be at 4 years." And
Mm.
so I was like, oh, that's smart. And so I chose this program. And because I chose my program at Widener University, I started doing practicums my first year. And so I had a variety of different placements in a private practice, in community mental health, in a school, and I worked in a group home for children, for adolescent girls. I worked in a psychiatric hospital. I had so many different venues that I could see what worked for me. And my final um, internship placement was at a residential treatment facility for sexual addiction, which a friend of mine was like, "Oh, you'd probably be really good at this." And I was like, "I'm not sure if I should take that as a compliment." But
Right.
as it turns out, I was really good at it.
Yeah.
So that was where my final dissertation focus ended up being in sex addiction. Prior to that, when I was working in the group home system with adolescent girls, I was actually going to do research based on that work that I was doing. But then when I decided I didn't want to do that, and my chair was like, "Well, I don't care about sex addiction."
Oh,
So
okay.
I had to find a new chair. And I was like, "Oh, Lord."
Yeah, that's some of the things we don't think of. Well, we think
Yeah.
about, but it's like it's something big to consider. Is like when you change the topic, it does impact sometimes who's leading that process
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah. So I had started out the project. It was going to be qualitative. And then when I decided I wasn't going to do that, I was leaving that placement. I didn't want to do that research anymore. And I'd started my internship at the sex addiction treatment facility. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's a thing that I might be interested in, doing my dissertation research on.
Yeah.
And he was like, oh, I'm not at all interested in that. So I ended up finding a chair. He was someone that I already knew. He actually worked at the facility prior to my starting there. And so we kind of overlapped for a few weeks
Oh, even
before
better.
he was like a professor. Um, I was his first dissertation that he was the chair of.
Okay.
And it worked really, really well because we already knew each other. And by that point, I knew myself a little better. And
Yeah.
so you asked about time management. So here's what needed to happen for my dissertation. The joke I always say is that I wrote my dissertation the night before, which is technically true, but also not true. What happened was after I'd been through my therapy and I had moved away from beating myself up and really wanted to work on what do I need to make this happen, I realized I need frequent deadlines. I told him, and I was like, I need to owe you something every week, every single week. Because if I have more than a week between times I owe you something, it's not going to get done. It's going to be half assed. And so he was like, okay. I met with him once a week, every week, the entire time. I would have to give him research. I would have to bring in, initial drafts of writing. I would have to do all of this stuff um, once a week. And every single week, the night before, I was up all night doing it. And, better to be up all night doing small chunks than trying to write a whole dissertation the night before.
Yeah, that is true. I had somebody recently who reached out for support, and they were like, "Yeah, I'm at there saying, they reached out, they needed support, and they had not written too much, maybe a page or two of their proposal." And I was like, "Oh, when do you expect to get this done?" They were like, "Oh, in about 2.5 weeks from now." I'm like, "Whew, do you realize the amount of work that has to go into that?" And so, like you said, I'm glad that you thought, I need a
I
little bit of
need,
time versus
I
trying to like
need,
stress.
listen, I need a lot of structure.
Yeah,
And I'm not sure if I would have been able to, one, come to that conclusion, and two, ask for what I need if I hadn't gone to therapy
yeah,
like a year and a half prior. Because that really, like, that switch in mindset from I can't to okay, what do I need to do? Or what do I need in order to make this happen? And she was fantastic, because what we ended up talking about for real was, I was doing all of this stuff. I was making myself miserable. Everything was late. I was, making myself crazy. And she's like, "Oh, are your grades suffering?" I was like, "No." And she was like, "Oh." And so she was basically like, "Well, look, you have plan A, which is you want to get the assignment, start working on it little by little, have it done a couple days before, go over it, have it printed out, have a nice, well-rested night of sleep, and then go to class like a person who gets shit done on time. But if that doesn't happen, plan B hasn't failed you."
yeah.
And I was like, I mean, I guess that's fair. She's like, you hate it and you don't like it, but it has not failed you. And changing the perspective in that way of saying, I can figure out what stars need to align in order for plan A to happen. And I can try my best to make those happen. And if it doesn't go exactly according to plan B is always there. It's always available to me. Doing things at the last minute and driving myself crazy, not getting any sleep is still an option.
That's interesting. That might be the title of the episode. Something about the last doing thing, getting done the night before. What'd you say? I wrote my dissertation in the
I
day.
wrote my dissertation the night before,
Yeah, so
yes.
that's gonna be the name of this episode. I'm gonna write
Ooh,
that down.
clickbait.
There we go. Dissertation the night before. But no, but what you did is that you found what system worked best for you. While in your mind it may not have been quote ideal, but it worked for what you needed
You
to.
got the job done,
Yeah,
and it was funny because when we started to focus on what are the stars and planets that need to align for plan A to happen, that got me focused away from all the ways in which I'm a failure and
mm,
to like, well, there have been times. What made it different that time? And
mm,
what we discovered is that I work best at night. I work best around other people who are doing work. I cannot get things done in my own home. I did know that. I used to, in undergrad, I used to go and be in my friends' dorm rooms to do my homework. It didn't matter what was going on in there. I just couldn't do anything in my own space. It
gotcha.
was very distracting. So I wrote my entire dissertation at Panera, and I would be there all day. I would write, I would take breaks, I would people watch. I got to know like the ways that people would come around 8 in the morning and then around 11 and then around 5. It was interesting to see. And then the age demographics, I was very observant of what was going on, but it gave me an opportunity to have a place that had free Wi-Fi and good snacks to do my work without being in my home being distracted by all of my delightful toys, whatever they might be.
No, that makes sense. And so a number of, I think, insight for folks who are watching is going to be just the idea. You got to figure out what system works best for you. Like for me, I honestly I can work anywhere. I think my background in music, when you're playing an instrument in the orchestra, you learn how to tune out everybody else so that you can hear, or you need to hear certain instruments. So I've had that skill set of tuning, just blocking out everything. So I don't.
Mhm.
For me, it didn't matter where I worked, but I worked better in the morning. I didn't really
Mm.
after like 4 o'clock. I'm done. Like my brain is fried.
I'm the exact opposite. I can't do a damn thing until the sun goes down, honestly. Like I tried so hard, but for me, again, undiagnosed ADHD at the time, I, even as a child, always needed background noise.
Mm,
If it was too quiet, I couldn't focus.
yeah,
But if it was too noisy, I couldn't focus, like finding that sweet spot.
yeah,
I used to always, even in high school, I used to listen to classical music while I did my work because I needed music. But if it had words, I would focus on the words.
I'm the
And then I
same
would
way.
either be singing along or trying to memorize them and not doing my work. And so music with no words really helped. And so I don't, you're younger than me, but there was always these infomercials that had these classical music CDs.
Hmm.
Like one was called Classical Thunder, and it had a lot of like Mozart and Vivaldi, and I really loved the sort of high percussive music.
Yeah,
It really helped so that I could focus on something else. Even now, I go to those like lo-fi hip hop YouTube pages and put that on while I'm doing my grown up work,
that makes sense.
because I do need something in order to focus, which is a weird concept for a lot of people. But if you know, if you got the ADHD, it's a struggle.
Yeah, I'm right with you on that. So I write, let's see, when I wrote my dissertation, uh, either I have an album that I've heard so many times that I don't care about the words. So sometimes I
Mhm,
would just listen to the same album, even if it had words, it's on repeat. Or for me, what I used to do is out it's called Hidden Beach Recording. So if you type this in,
mhm,
and they have all these volumes, and they take all of R&B and hip hop music, and it's like jazz. So there's some words part of the
mhm,
hooks, but then everything else is like instrumental. And that was just something that could
mhm.
just be in the background, but still have
That's
some
nice.
type of rhythm that would allow me to kind of like, all right, I'm in the zone to kind of write. And I would notice I would get in the cadence about, okay, the first song I'm like foggy, and then by the time the second song comes in, I'm pretty clear
Good.
on where I'm going with the writing at that
Yeah.
point.
Yeah, and like you said, being a psychology major, these are the kinds of things that I think about and that matter. Was basically like I need to figure out what works for me
Yeah,
instead of being upset at myself for not being like them.
yeah,
Because my friends they were like, "Why are you doing?" Like I had a friend who was very prone to anxiety, and so me, like he would ask me like a week and a half before something was due. Is like, "Oh, how is that thing going?" I'm like, "Oh, I haven't started yet." He's like, "Why are you doing this?" I'm like, "Is this really impacting you?" But he would be stressed on my behalf. And I'm not someone that necessarily shows a lot of stress, even if I feel a lot of stress, which I think is really common among Black people, honestly, most of the time.
like
We look like really calm, but inside we're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Oh my God.
yeah,
But yeah, I was really caught up in like, why can't I be normal? Like
no,
a normal person who gets her assignment and does it in a timely fashion. I will sit and just not do it until things get dire. And I kept saying, and I say to this day, um, I'm not going to change unless something drastic happens. That's just
mm,
a fact. And I don't think anything drastic is going to happen because I've come to be able to create the structure that I need for myself, as opposed to beating myself up.
no, I love that. And so, as you develop your approach to doing things. And so tell us a little bit about your dissertation research and what did you find and what did you go into this project to do, and talk a little bit about that work.
So that time in my life was very stressful, and it has been really difficult for me to remember a lot.
Mm,
Um, but what I ended up doing was a entirely theoretical dissertation, which nobody at the time told me that that was harder than just collecting data and analyzing it. I should have done that.
yeah, you should, because that is
I
hard.
didn't know.
That is really hard work.
It was a lot. It was a ton of research. And, my chair, who was really great, came to a point where he had to cut me off. He was like, okay, you are not going to know everything. And if you keep on this research hamster wheel, you will never write your dissertation, because I would find an article, and in that article they reference something else. So I'd have to find that article and then figure out who they're referencing. And I was just collecting and collecting and collecting and collecting information, and I wasn't producing anything. And he was like, I'm not going to be on this dissertation chair for 3 years. You're going to have to do something. And so he gave me a cutoff date after which I could no longer be looking up research. And at that point, I needed to start writing. I needed to start organizing. I needed to start producing. So my dissertation focus was on the use of schema focused therapy to to understand and treat sexual addiction.
Mm.
That was a rough one.
Yeah.
It was really hard because there hadn't been, and there still kind of isn't, a ton of research on sex addiction in the first place. And so I had to research like peripheral things. I had to
Yeah.
do a lot of research about schema focused therapy, which a lot of people didn't know about at that time. I think a lot of people don't really know about it now, but that's
For
beside
folks
the
who are
point.
wide, what is it? Just so you give us the quick like.
So yeah, so schema focused therapy is a form of psychotherapy that combines a bunch of different modalities. And it was developed after seeing that there were a certain type of client who would always turn out to be a treatment failure when it came to cognitive behavioral therapy.
Okay.
And they posited that if you're dealing with characterological issues, that means personality disorders, chronic mood disorders, addiction, and things of that nature, that CBT would always work while you're doing it, and then you wouldn't continue and you would just go back. And so they developed schema focused therapy, which combines CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It also combines with attachment theory
Okay.
and with object relations therapy, which is um, focused on the your family of origin and those roles. And
Mm.
it's really, it's very kind of a comprehensive type of therapy that has a lot of, it's kind of related to the name of my business, which is insight to action. So the insight part, which is more of the psychodynamic modalities of
Yeah.
understanding how this came to be, what it means, what it doesn't mean, and then moving towards what you're going to do about it,
Mhm.
is kind of why I gravitated towards schema focused therapy. A schema being sort of the lens through which you see the world. Some people have positive schemas, like they basically just think, hey, things are going to work out. It's going to be
Yeah.
great. There are people who truly believe that and they move through the world in that way. And that works for them, because the thing about a schema is that you'll always notice everything that supports it, and you'll always be able to ignore anything that refutes it.
Mm.
That's all well and good when you have positive schemas, but when you have maladaptive schemas, that becomes problematic. And so I use that work. I was using that as I was working with the clientele at the internship, which then became, afterwards became my postdoc. I was already doing schema work with the clients, so I could see how it was useful in sort of conceptualizing what was happening for them and moving towards treatment that could be useful for them long term. And so that research process was extensive.
Yeah, that theoretical stuff is tough because I developed in my dissertation in like the last chapter. I kind of put forth a theory that I was thinking about based on my data, but I didn't have a way to write it. It took me like I think 5 or 6 years later to publish that paper about the theory because I just had to wrap my mind around all that stuff. So to actually do a whole dissertation of theory, so much respect
Yeah.
to you. But
Yeah, it was rough. And so there are times when I like kind of feel like, oh, I didn't really do a real dissertation. I didn't collect any data. And then sometimes I'm like, girl, you wish you collected data.
yeah, I've been write it up, do your
Like
analysis.
I could run some ANOVAs, like, but this mess, this was hard. This was very difficult.
Yeah, it's heady work. Oh no, so that's cool. So it's good to hear too because I think at least I've had I was at an institution as a professor where I actually had PsyD students that worked with me, even though I'm not inside, I wasn't in the PsyD program, and so there's like this idea about those programs in particular. They're all like so practitioner, but you did something very theoretical that a lot of times PhD students honestly would be quote traditionally would do more theoretical work. So I'm just glad to
Mm.
show like there are a number of ways to approach research despite whatever degree program you're in. Sometimes we get caught up in
Yeah.
what should we do, the practitioner degree or the core research degree, and I'm like, it doesn't matter,
But
like, you know.
the thing, well, these days they're closer in
Yes.
content than they had been when I went to school.
Yeah.
But also, like the PsyD program is a scholar practitioner model,
Yeah.
and people seem to always leave out the scholar part.
Correct.
We do have to, we have to not only be well versed in doing research, we have to be well versed in consuming research.
Correct.
And that was something that I still take with me, just the ways in which when research comes out and they talk about it in the mainstream media, it's always these little snips, little snippets, little bites. But if you look at the entirety of the work, you can be like, oh, well, these methods are flawed. And the conclusion that you're putting on the news is not the conclusion that they came to. But most of us are not, most of the world is not well versed in how to consume research. And that is a huge thing that you learn in graduate school.
Yeah, if you go to a good program that teaches that, there are a lot of folks that carry out uninformed work too. You know, just the
Oh yeah, that's true. That's
yeah,
true.
yeah. You got to
We
have
had
good
we
training.
had a one professor who was determined y'all are not gonna be out here embarrassing me. So we went through a lot of things. That's why every time I hear the disclaimers on antidepressant medications that it may cause suicidal ideation in adolescence, I get so upset because that was one of the studies that we looked at in class, and we're like, that's not what it said.
Mhm.
But it's out there, and enough people have said it that now it has to be a warning on the medication. And it's like, wow,
Yeah, so these things have definitely.
uninformed people have a lot of power.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. And so, as you finished that workout, you did your postdoc. What made you decide to jump into your own business in terms of providing therapy services for folks, and what brought you to Insight to Action?
I never wanted to. I had convinced myself, and so I guess this is a story of all the things that I convinced myself about myself that turned out to just be things that I thought and not who I am as a person. I
Sure.
had convinced myself that I was not interested in having my own business. I don't have an entrepreneurial spirit. I'm not somebody who wants to own a private practice. I figured for the rest of my life I would work for somebody, and that's how it would work out. And so I stayed at the place where I did my internship and postdoc for 6 years. And then I left that place to take a job as a VA psychologist. And I stayed at the VA for 6 years. And I became uncomfortable with some of the things that I was seeing kind of happening and changing in terms of how we treat veterans. And I came to a conclusion that I'm not interested in these metrics that don't feel like they're considering the humans. And so, if I'm not going to do what they tell me to do, the likelihood is they're going to want to fire me. So I might as well quit. I started my practice while I was still working at the VA. I did it part time. I did it specifically because a good friend of mine, who I was her supervisor, she had become a clinical director and was like, I have a client and you're the only person that I think can work with him. So get your practice going. So I did. I think over the course of a week, I came up with a name. I got an LLC. I found myself some office space to lease. I incorporated my business. Like I did everything that I needed to do just because of that one client. And then that one turned into a couple more. And so
Yeah.
I was working 4 days a week at the VA and had one day a week that I would see clients in my private practice. And I did not want to see more than 4 people. I was uninterested in that. And I was not dealing with insurance, it was cash pay. And
I
so,
hear my mom's a therapist, and so I
was,
hear about that all. Oh gosh, you just
yeah.
taking
And
that
so
yeah.
I did that for about 2 years. And then during the pandemic, I left the VA and I was like, okay, I guess we're going to expand the practice. And so now, I see people doing therapy, but I keep that caseload low. I do a lot of consultation work, a lot of, what do they call that? 1099
Sure.
contracts kind of
Yeah.
thing. Because what I realized at the VA was that I was getting burned out because it was lacking in diversity.
Mm.
It was just patient, 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 patient every hour on the hour. Now I see patients, but I also am clinical director at a small agency. I also do clinical supervision. I also do workshops and trainings. I speak at conferences. I'll be at one next month. I'm able to have some variety in what I do, which what I learned in industrial and organizational psychology is the key to not being disgruntled.
Hmm. Yeah, to have some variety and mix of that. That makes sense. And so, as you develop the business, I know you didn't go into it necessarily to even create all of this, but what have you learned so far being in business about growing the business? I'm just curious about your insights about what you learned so far. There might be people who are watching who might want to start their therapy, practice and try
Mhm.
to build it. And so, what are some things
Yeah.
that you learned so far?
So the one thing that I learned is that if you already have a job, it's really easy to start to practice because you have income, and there are things that you don't have to worry about because you have income. I had good income because I worked for the VA, and so when it came time to pay for my business license, to pay for my LLC, to pay for the office space, to pay for the things that I needed to be able to conduct business, the books that I wanted to get, like I had that money before I had clients. And so that made for a very, very easy transition. Um, so what I learned is that having startup money is key to not being very, very, very stressed out, and also to not getting into a position where you're doing things you don't want to do, where you're seeing clients you don't want to see, where you're taking insurance when you don't want to take insurance. Because sometimes if you start without any kind of startup capital, you find yourself agreeing to things that generally you might not want to agree to. I know it's not something that everyone can do, but if you have a job, keep your job while you start your practice. Get established before you leave. That's one of the best pieces of advice. The other piece is like get some systems in place. I'm still struggling with that part. Getting systems in place in terms of what is your what's your procedure for taking on new clients? How will you know when it's time to stop taking on new clients? What does your paperwork look like? How does that get delivered? How are you going to be paid and how much? All of the things that you have to consider. What kind of other services are you going to offer? Consider those things before you hang a shingle, and figure out how to do that. Because I did it on
Mm.
the fly. I started my practice specifically to see one person,
Sure.
and that was it. So I didn't think about a lot of that stuff early on. And I also had a full time job. So I had the luxury
Yeah.
of not having to be particularly well organized, but the organization is key.
Yeah. And I tell people all the time who are considering, going into business is like, you having a job and keeping that job while you start your business is like the best thing you can do. It's hard when you jump out the door and say, "Hey, I'm no job. I'm just gonna go all in." It looks glossy on Instagram and Facebook. People like, "Oh, I went from zero
I
to
quit
six
my nine to
figures
five.
in 3 weeks." And like that's not how it happens. It takes a little while and build
Yeah.
momentum with it.
Yeah. I think we get caught up on outliers and
Yeah.
get disappointed in ourselves when we are just one of the regular folk, which statistically speaking, most of us are.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, and then the idea that think through who you're going to target, who's your client, how long you're going to work with, how many you're going to take on, and like you said, make it beneficial to your lifestyle. That seems to be like even underneath that, it's like, hey, I want this to serve me versus me serving it.
Mhm.
Which
Yeah,
is
I
really
decided a very long time ago that I don't wanna do my work resentful, and
mm,
so that means saying no to things. That means, holding on to those boundaries that are gonna keep my well-being at the forefront, because if I'm not taking care of myself, I will be a terrible therapist, and I don't wanna harm other people and harm myself at the same time. So there are a lot of things that I just have to say no to because I'm just not gonna do that. Because if I do it, Imma be mad, and I
yeah.
don't wanna do things being mad.
Indeed. No, I love that. And before we wrap up, I do want to ask this question because we talked about it before we started in terms of your work in terms of your first book around helping Black women how to secure and find Black therapists. So I'm curious about that book and that work and what Black women can what your model or approach is to finding a therapist. I know a lot of folks are seeking out therapy but just not sure where or how to start.
Yeah, so I wrote that specifically because I always got that question. In my friend group, I was the person to ask. And a lot of the time, what would happen is I would be like, all right, what's your zip code? All right, are you using insurance or cash? Okay. Um, what's your price limit? And then I would do research and I would send them names. Like this is
Mm.
something that I would do for friends. Um, and I decided like I wrote it initially as an ebook. It's now available as a print book on Amazon, but I initially did it as an ebook as just a handbook guide for specifically for busy black women who are working, who are have got a lot on their plate, and the task of finding a therapist feels incredibly daunting and time consuming, and they don't know that they have the time, which means that they put off the work that they could be doing towards their own healing. And so it's mainly about self-assessment about where am I. Am I ready to do the work? Because it is work. Am I willing to do the work? And then the next part is about like, where do I look for a therapist? And what really comes up a lot is, what do I ask once I get this person on the phone? And how do I know if it's a good match? And so in the book, I run through like a ton of questions to ask. And I also talk about the questions that you need to ask yourself, as well as what do you ask a therapist in order to try to decide if it's a good fit. And the bottom line is, be picky. This is trial and error. Don't give up on therapy just because you met one person and it wasn't a good fit, because there's too many of us out there for that to be the reason that you don't get help. But deciding what matters to you about the person that you're gonna divulge a lot of things that you don't tell anybody else is really important, and then finding that person takes some time.
Yeah, no, I agree 100% with that. I remember I was looking for a therapist, and I wanted a black male with a doctorate, and it just took a while to kind of piece it all
Yeah,
together, like to find what I was looking for,
yeah. As far as I recall, I think Black doctoral level clinicians are maybe like 2 to 4%.
yeah.
So while we are out here, I'm not going to lie to you and say that we're abundant.
Yeah, no, no, for sure. So I think what you get at it makes really makes a lot of sense in terms of what you're looking for and making sure you
Mhm.
ask the right questions. And so with that, on the flip side, if who is your ideal client? So if someone's watching and maybe looking and trying to seek a therapist, who is the type of client you like to work with in your practice?
Right now, these days, I'm really excited about working with specifically Black women who are adult children of addiction, alcoholism, childhood dysfunction, um, on working on figuring out how that has impacted them and how it continues to impact them at work, in their relationships with other people, as well as their relationship with themselves. I do a lot of work around teaching people pleasers to become more assertive. And I do a lot of couples work, and I specifically do couples work around, you know, building actual intimacy and being open and vulnerable when you have a history of that not going so well. So that's mainly who I work with these days. So I specifically work a lot with Black women, and I do a lot of couples work with Black couples. And I've gotten a whole lot of training in couples therapy, and having to adapt it to fit the differences that you see with Black couples, and also just other couples of color, where there are a lot of things that are in theories that it's like, that doesn't feel like it's true for us. And so,
Yeah.
it's always on Black clinicians to figure out what is actually applying to us and what's not, and to use that to sort of help our clientele.
No, I love that. And that's a great way. I definitely want to say thank you and end this here. Well, thank you so much for your time. But where can people find you if they want to reach out to you, get more information? Where would you like for them to catch up with you?
Sure. So I'm on Instagram at Tanisha Saidi, and my website, insight2action.net, is like the catch-all place where you can find me. I've started a YouTube channel, but I've not yet posted any videos, and that is Ask a Black Psychologist.
Oh, that's dope. Yeah, you gotta start putting those videos out. That's something that
I know. Getting myself in front of the camera to do the work is actually the worst part. Like I've scripted videos, I have a ton of ideas because I get questions all the time, and it's essentially like I'm answering the questions, and I'm specifically in mind thinking of the Black women, adult children
yeah.
of addiction who have specific questions around relationships, around work, and around how they feel about themselves.
Mm.
Tons of video ideas, and I just haven't sat down and pressed record.
What just a hack, and this for anybody else who's interested in content creation. What I would suggest, if it's hard to start that way, do it live every time, and like
Every time.
go live like this every time. Get the questions that come in the comments, then you just answer them on the spot.
Oh,
Now you
that's
can
fair.
cut those up, and then those could be clips for later. So that way you don't even have to be so formal. It's like, oh, I got to sit down, I got to record. It doesn't matter. Hey, I'm going to jump on live. I'm going to do what I got to do. And then
Hmm.
whoever answers or asks questions, ask on that episode. If not, come back next week and do it again and again. And before you
Yeah,
know it, you'll build momentum. And you won't.
that's a smart idea, and I do owe my IG community a live because I had posted a question and they had asked for elaboration, but I've been swamped with both jet lag and work after coming back from the East Coast. So I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna start out going live and see what I can make happen.
Cool. All right, y'all. Make sure y'all catch up with Dr. Ranger. Dr. Ranger, I'm gonna put you behind the scenes for a second. And again, thank you so much for being on this episode. Again, thank you all so much for watching this episode of From ABD to PhD. I hope you all got a lot of insights about just how to navigate and create structures for the dissertation process, but also thinking about not only what you're doing as doctoral students, but then preparing for life after, because there is a life after. You're not going to be in this process forever. So take the time to really get the skills, get the opportunities and experiences that will prepare you for different types of opportunities post-doctorate. And again, if you're interested in more episodes like this, make sure you go to our YouTube channel at Done Dissertation. And again, I'm going to say thank you all so much for tuning in. And I'm Dr. Ramon Goings, founder of Done Dissertation, and we demystify the dissertation process so that doctoral students can write and defend a dissertation in 1 year or less. This episode of From ABD to PhD is sponsored by the Done Dissertation Velocity Group Coaching Program. It is a coaching program with a 4-month time frame in order to help you defend and write either your dissertation proposal or final dissertation in 4 months. So if you're someone who wants to finish the doctorate quickly, are tired of being ABD, tired of paying tuition, and tired of not achieving and getting to that successful point, and you're tired of not fulfilling your purpose as to why you even got to the doctoral program to begin with, definitely reach out to us and visit www.velocitydissertation.com. Until next time, I will see you all soon. Take care.